In 406 BC, Athens won a battle it had no business winning. Outnumbered, outfunded, manned partly by slaves who had been promised freedom in exchange for picking up an oar. The city had scraped together everything it had left: melted temple silver, conscripted aristocrats, freed men who had never seen open water, and sent them into the Aegean with one instruction: don't let Sparta close the straits. They won. Against every military calculation of the war, against the trajectory of the last decade, against the logic of a city that had already lost a generation in Sicily, Athens won the largest naval battle of the entire Peloponnesian War. And then they came home, and Athens executed the generals who won it, not in the heat of battle, not by accident. The 6 commanders who had saved the city were summoned before the assembly, condemned in a vote that every Athenian lawyer in the room knew was illegal, and put to death within days. Socrates, yes, that Socrates, stood up during the proceedings and told the crowd it could not do this. The crowd shouted him down and did it anyway. 1 year later, Athens had no fleet. 1 year after that, it had no empire. 2 years after that illegal vote, Spartan soldiers walked through the city gates while the long walls, the great symbol of Athenian defiance, the engineering achievement that had kept this city unconquerable for 50 years, were torn down to the music of flutes. This is not the story of how Athens lost a war. This is the story of how a democracy used its own freedom to destroy itself. And more than that, it is the story of why, given everything that came before, that destruction was almost impossible to avoid. To understand what Athens threw away, you have to understand what Athens had become. And to understand that, you have to understand the deal at the center of the whole arrangement. Because it was a deal, not an ideal. After the Persian Wars, Athens had done something no other Greek city managed. It had beaten the Persian Empire twice, then built a maritime empire of its own on the wreckage of that victory. The Delian League started as a defense alliance. 30 years later, it was something else entirely. Member cities sent tribute to Athens. Athens sent ships in return. The distinction between ally and subject had blurred, then disappeared. Every city that paid understood the arrangement perfectly. Athens called it protection. The rest of Greece called it what it was, an empire that hadn't admitted it yet. The money flowed in. The silver from subject cities funded the Parthenon, funded the public works, funded the wages of the men who rowed the fleet. The Thetes, Athens' poorest citizens, the men who had no land, no wealth, no safety net other than the war economy that kept them employed. That is the detail that drives everything else. In Athens, power followed the fleet. The men who rowed the warships were the men who voted in the assembly. The empire was not an abstraction to them. It was a paycheck. It was the difference between feeding your children and not. When the empire came under threat, their anxiety was not philosophical. It was existential. Sparta had watched all of this with deep unease. The Spartan model, a warrior society built on discipline, land, and the labor of an enslaved population called helots, was the opposite of everything Athens represented. Where Athens was restless, expanding, commercial, and democratic, Sparta was closed, conservative, and profoundly suspicious of change. For decades, the two cities had circled each other, each growing more convinced the other was an existential threat. In 431 BC, they stopped circling. The war that followed was supposed to last a few years. It lasted 27. And by the time it ended, the city that started it would barely recognize what it had become. By 406 BC, the year this story really begins, Athens was a city that had been through the fire, and was still barely standing. 13 years earlier, it had sent the greatest military expedition in its history to conquer Syracuse, the most powerful city in Sicily. The campaign ended in a catastrophe that had no equal in Greek history. 200 ships, 40,000 men. Generals executed or worked to death in stone quarries under the Sicilian sun. In a single campaign, Athens had bled out a generation, and yet, Athens had not surrendered. It had rebuilt. Painfully, through emergency taxation and desperate improvisation, the city had scraped together a new fleet. It had survived 2 internal coups by oligarchs who tried to use the crisis to overthrow democracy. It had watched its silver mines fall into Spartan hands. It had lost access to its own farmland. Its entire survival now depended on grain shipped from the Black Sea, grain that had to pass through the Hellespont, a narrow strait that had become the most strategically important waterway in the world. Athens was running on fumes, but it was running. And 3 men, more than any others, would determine whether it kept running or finally stopped. The first was Cleophon. Cleophon was not a general, not a philosopher. He was a lyre-maker who had become the most powerful voice in the Athenian assembly by understanding one thing completely. A people who have been humiliated and exhausted don't want a strategy. They want someone to blame and someone to promise them it isn't over. The Thetes, the poor citizens who rode the fleet, who had no land to fall back on, who depended on war wages to survive, were his constituency. And Cleophon fed them exactly what they needed to hear to keep believing. Athens could still win. Peace was surrender. Any man who spoke of compromise was a traitor to the city and to the dead. He was brilliant at this, and he was catastrophically wrong. Against him stood Theramenes. His enemies called him the Cothornus, the boot that fits either foot, because he had a habit of ending up on whichever side seemed most likely to survive. He had collaborated with the oligarchic coup of 411 BC, then helped restore democracy when the coup failed. He was pragmatic, politically gifted, and deeply unsentimental about ideology. His great insight, the one that made him dangerous and ultimately couldn't save him, was that Athens was losing. That losing slowly was worse than making a deal while there was still something to deal with. He was right, and almost no one wanted to hear it. The third man was not Athenian. Lysander was the Spartan admiral who had spent years building the machine that would finally break Athens. He was not a typical Spartan. Spartans were disciplined but blunt. Lysander was subtle. He had cultivated a relationship with Cyrus the Younger, the Persian prince who controlled vast reserves of imperial gold, and used that gold to rebuild the Spartan fleet and to pay Spartan rowers more than Athens could pay its own. For the first time in the war, Sparta had a navy that could fight Athens on equal terms. Lysander was cold where Athenian commanders were emotional, patient where they were reckless. And he had arrived at a conclusion about his enemy that was as precise as it was lethal. Athens would defeat itself if you gave it enough time and enough pressure. He was right too. The difference between Lysander and Theramenes is that Lysander was on the winning side of that insight. In 406 BC, the Spartan admiral Callicratidas trapped the Athenian fleet under Conon at Mytilene on the island of Lesbos. Conon had 70 ships. Callicratidas had over 140. He blockaded the harbor and settled in to wait. The message that reached Athens was simple: act now or lose the fleet. Athens acted. It stripped itself of everything. Slaves were freed and given citizenship in exchange for rowing. Wealthy citizens who had never touched an oar were put to work on warships. Temple silver was melted down. The city that had been bled dry somehow found the will to build and man 150 ships in weeks, the largest desperate mobilization in Athenian history. 8 generals were appointed to command it. One of them was Pericles the Younger, the son of Athens' greatest statesman, carrying his father's name into a war his father had started. The 2 fleets met near the Arginusae Islands off the coast of Asia Minor. Athens arranged its ships in double lines to compensate for inexperienced crews. The battle that followed was the largest naval engagement of the entire Peloponnesian War. Athens won. Callicratidas died in the fighting, knocked overboard, according to some accounts, drowned in the Aegean while his fleet fell apart around him. 70 Spartan ships were sunk or captured. It was the most decisive Athenian naval victory in more than a decade. Then the storm came. It rose without warning, the way Aegean storms do. 25 Athenian ships had been wrecked or damaged in the battle. Their crews were in the water, alive but barely, clinging to broken timber across miles of churning sea. The 8 generals faced an impossible calculation. Protocol: rescue the survivors and collect the dead. Military logic: pursue the retreating Spartan fleet before it could regroup. The storm: neither was fully possible with the ships they had. They split the task. The main fleet would pursue. A detachment under Theramenes and Thrasybulus, capable officers but not fleet commanders, would lead the rescue. The storm made the rescue impossible. The men drowned. Thousands of Athenian citizens, men who had been alive and victorious 1 hour earlier, sank into the Aegean while the rescue ships fought the waves and could not reach them. When the news reached Athens, the city did not celebrate the victory. It demanded to know who was responsible for the dead. The politics of grief are not rational. They are not supposed to be. Athens in the autumn of 406 BC had been at war for 25 years. It had buried its sons at Marathon, at Syracuse, in a dozen battles across the Aegean. It had survived plague, internal coup, and strategic catastrophe. And every time, it had survived by telling itself the suffering was not in vain, that the next battle, the next campaign, would be the one that finally justified the cost. Now, in the waters off Arginusae, thousands more were dead, not killed in battle, left to drown, while ships that could have saved them chose to pursue the retreating enemy. That is how the demagogues framed it, and the framing stuck. Theramenes moved first. He was a politician in a system that punished association with failure, and he understood that Athens' anger needed a direction. He wrote to the assembly suggesting the generals had failed to give clear rescue orders. The generals, hearing this, wrote back blaming Theramenes and the storm. Now 2 groups of credible men were publicly accusing each other, and the assembly was watching. Cleophon saw his moment. The war party had a specific interest that went beyond grief. A clean victory at Arginusae was dangerous to Cleophon. Clean victories generated pressure for peace negotiations. But a tainted victory, a victory soaked in the blood of abandoned men, was something else. It was a victory that demanded punishment, demanded anger, demanded the war continue. Cleophon shaped the narrative with the precision of a man who understood that the story matters more than the facts. The generals were summoned to Athens. The hearings were heated. The generals explained the storm, the distances, the state of the fleet. Some Athenians were persuaded. The emotional temperature in the city kept rising anyway. And then a man named Calixinus stood up in the assembly with a proposal that would break everything. Athenian law required individual trials. Each general would be heard separately, evidence presented against him alone, a verdict reached on specific charges. This wasn't bureaucratic convention. It was a foundational protection. The encoded recognition that the crowd's passion and one man's guilt are not the same thing. Calixenus proposed abandoning it. One vote. All 6 generals together. Guilty or not guilty as a group. The Prytanes, the 50 citizens serving as the assembly's presiding committee that day, refused to put the motion forward. It was illegal, they said. The law does not permit trying 6 men as one. The assembly turned on them. Voices rose, threats were made. Some called for the Prytanes themselves to be prosecuted if they continued to obstruct the people's will. The committee members looked out at thousands of angry men, many of them relatives of the drowned, all of them exhausted and primed by months of Cleophon's rhetoric. And one by one, they folded. All except one. One member of the Prytanes refused. He said the motion was illegal and that he would not preside over an illegal proceeding. He said this to a crowd already threatening to prosecute anyone who stood in its way. He said it knowing exactly what kind of room he was standing in. His name was Socrates. He was shouted down. The motion was put to a vote. The 6 generals were condemned. Pericles the Younger, son of the man who had built Athens's golden age, who had commissioned the Parthenon, who had designed the strategy that kept the city alive for the first decade of this war, was among those executed. He died because the city his father built used its democracy to kill him, and the philosopher who had refused to authorize the illegal vote would himself be tried and executed by that same democracy 7 years later. The pattern, once it starts, does not stop at generals. Many Athenians felt sick about it almost immediately. Ancient sources record that in the days after the executions, citizens began saying they had been deceived, that Calixenus had manipulated the assembly, that the storm had been real, the rescue genuinely impossible, and that they had killed their own victorious commanders out of grief and manufactured rage. Calixenus was eventually prosecuted. He would die in disgrace, but he was prosecuted later, in calmer moments, after the fever broke. The 6 generals were not brought back, and now Sparta, watching all of this with the cold focus of a patient predator, made a move that tested whether Athens had any survival instinct left at all. Sparta sent peace envoys. The terms were not humiliating, they were survivable. Athens could keep its walls. It could keep a reduced but intact fleet. Its exiles could return. The empire was gone, but Athens as a city, as a democracy, as a community of people on a particular piece of Attic ground, Athens could continue to exist. Sparta made this offer not out of generosity. Lysander was coming back. He was too talented to leave on the sidelines, and Spartan politics had found a way to return him to command. Sparta knew what Lysander would do when he returned, and even Sparta wasn't entirely certain the outcome would be permanent. The peace offer was a calculation, not a concession. The assembly voted on it. Cleophon appeared. Whether he was drunk that day, as some sources suggest, or simply operating at his most theatrical, the substance was consistent. Any man who spoke of peace with Sparta was a traitor. Athens had just won its greatest naval victory in a decade. The dead at Arginusae deserved to be avenged by victory, not compromise. One more battle, one more year, Athens rejected the peace. This was the second fatal vote. The first had killed 6 generals. The second killed the city. Because Lysander was already preparing to return, and the 6 commanders who had shown they could fight him to a decisive outcome, who had improvised a battle formation that worked, who had managed inexperienced crews in the largest engagement of the war, were dead. Athens would now have to face the most capable naval strategist alive with second-tier officers, a depleted treasury, and the ghost of an illegal verdict hanging over the entire enterprise. The war party had won the argument. They had no idea what they had just done. There was one man alive who understood exactly what was about to happen. He had been watching from a tower on the Thracian coast, living as an exile in the borderlands between the Greek world and the barbarian north. His political career finished, his reputation permanently split between the men who thought him a genius and the men who thought him a traitor. Both groups were right. His name was Alcibiades. He had been the architect of the Sicilian disaster, the man who talked Athens into the greatest military catastrophe in its history, then fled to Sparta when accused of religious sacrilege, then betrayed Sparta when Sparta became inconvenient, then clawed his way back into Athenian favor through a string of naval victories, then lost one engagement when a subordinate ignored his orders and attacked without him, and been exiled again when Athens used the defeat as an excuse to remove him. He was living in Thrace in 405 BC when the Athenian fleet anchored at Aegospotami, Goats Rivers, a stretch of open beach on the European side of the Hellespont, directly across from Lysander's base at Lampsakos. 180 ships, 36,000 men. Alcibiades rode down from his tower. He went to the camp. He spoke to the generals. He was specific. Aegospotami was indefensible, an open beach with no harbor, no market, no local supply. Every day the crews had to scatter across miles of coastline to find food, and Lysander, patient, cold, methodical Lysander, was watching from across the strait, waiting for exactly that kind of vulnerability to ripen. "Move to Sestos," Alcibiades said. "Sestos has a harbor, a market, allied territory for resupply. At Sestos, the fleet keeps its discipline. At Aegospotami, it is only a matter of time." The generals looked at him. Hay saw a convicted traitor, a disgraced exile with no commission, no authority, a right to stand in their camp and give orders. They told him to leave. He left. And he was right about everything. For 4 days, Lysander did nothing. Every morning, the Athenian fleet rowed out and formed battle lines across the strait. Every morning, the Spartan ships stayed in harbor. Every afternoon, the Athenians waited as long as patience held, then rowed back to the beach. And every afternoon, as the men landed, something loosened. Discipline requires constant maintenance. Boredom is its enemy. Hunger accelerates everything. By the second day, the forage parties were ranging further. By the third, some ships were half-manned when they returned to position. The generals were losing the slow argument with entropy that every commander in a waiting game eventually loses. Lysander sent a scout ship each day to observe, not to engage, to observe. He was measuring the decay with the patience of a man who knows the decisive moment is coming and cannot afford to waste it. On the 5th day, the pattern repeated. The Athenian fleet rowed out. The waiting began. The afternoon came. The crews dispersed. Lysander's scouts sent the signal. He raised the fleet. 170 Spartan ships, disciplined formation, full speed across the Hellespont. The Athenian lookouts saw them. The warning went down the beach. Men started running. Generals screamed orders. Oarsmen who had wandered miles in search of food sprinted toward the water. It was already too late. It was almost immediately too late. Lysander's plan was not complex. It didn't need to be. Move fast, hit the ships before they're manned. Accept battle only where the outcome is already decided. Some Athenian ships managed to push off and form a ragged line. Most did not. Conon, one of the few experienced commanders at Aegospotami, saw within minutes that the battle was over before it started. He took 9 ships, punched through a gap in the Spartan line, and ran. Not out of cowardice. Out of the cold calculation that 9 ships in open water were worth more than 9 ships destroyed on a beach. He would eventually reach Cyprus. He would be the seed of a future Athenian naval revival that would arrive too late to matter. The rest of the fleet, 170 ships, was captured or destroyed in an afternoon. The men were rounded up on the beach. Lysander separated out those he believed had shown particular cruelty to Spartan prisoners in earlier engagements. He asked the Athenian general Philocles, who had reportedly thrown captive Spartan sailors overboard in a previous battle, what punishment he deserved for setting that precedent. Philocles told Lysander to stop searching for justifications and do what he was going to do. Lysander executed him. Approximately 3,000 Athenian prisoners were killed. The water of the Hellespont ran with the blood of the men who had been, 1 year earlier, the victors of Arginusae. It had taken one afternoon. 25 years of Athenian naval empire, built ship by ship since Salamis, maintained through plague and internal coup and the catastrophe of Sicily, ended before the sun went down. Lysander did not immediately march on Athens. He was too precise for that. First, he moved through the Hellespont and the Aegean systematically, cutting off every grain route, every allied city, every supply line. He was not constructing a military victory. He was constructing a stranglehold. When he finally sailed for Piraeus, it was not as a conqueror rushing to storm a city. It was as an undertaker who already knew the outcome. The news traveled by ship. A trireme called the Perillus arrived in the harbor of Piraeus in the night. And then, Xenophon was there and he recorded this. A sound began at the docks. A wail, wordless and enormous, it spread from the harbor through the streets, up the hills of the city, until it reached the walls. No one slept that night. Neighbor passing the news to neighbor, each telling a fresh wound. By morning, Athens knew. Athens did not surrender immediately. That too is part of the story. The habit of survival is hard to break. Citizens were mobilized. Emergency stockpiles gathered. Cleophon argued that resistance was still possible, that Sparta would tire, that help might come. He was doing what he had always done, telling a frightened people what they needed to hear to keep fighting. Lysander arrived with 200 ships and sealed the harbor. The Spartan king Agis, who had been camped in Attica for years, watching the countryside slowly die, marched his army to the city walls. A second Spartan king, Pausanias, brought a second army from the Peloponnese. The trap that had been tightening for a year closed completely. Athens began to starve. Starvation is not dramatic. It is slow and inexorable, and it does not resolve itself through heroism. The grain ships could not get through. The farmland had been denied for years. The treasury was gone. And the war party, Cleophon's party, the men who had executed the generals, who had rejected the peace, who had sent the fleet to Aegospotami, had nothing left to offer. Cleophon was arrested on a procedural charge and executed. One of the grimmer ironies of this entire story, the man most responsible for blocking the peace that could have saved Athens, died before he could watch the city surrender, killed by the same political machinery he had spent years operating. Theramenes went to Lysander. He spent 3 months negotiating the terms. Corinth and Thebes wanted Athens erased, the city physically destroyed, its population scattered. Sparta refused. A dead Athens created a power vacuum that served no one's long-term interests. The Spartans proposed a middle path. The terms arrived in the spring of 404 BC. The long walls, the great parallel fortifications connecting the city to Piraeus, the engineering achievement that Themistocles had built after Salamis, the walls that had made Athens a strategic island even on land, would be demolished. Every stone. Athens would surrender all but 12 ships. It would give up every overseas territory. It would accept back its oligarchic exiles, returning with Spartan expectations about what they would do with the power they recovered. Athens would become a subordinate ally of Sparta. The Athenian assembly voted to accept. The Spartans came with picks and sledgehammers. They brought flute players. The demolition of the long walls was staged as a celebration, and in a sense it was. A celebration of the end of something that had defined the Greek world for 50 years. Block by block, the walls came down. A city that had stood against the Persian Empire, that had built the Parthenon, that had produced Sophocles and Thucydides and Socrates, that had invented the idea that free people should govern themselves. That city watched its greatest symbol of defiance reduced to rubble while the music played. And the crowd that had voted to kill its own generals stood in the ruins of what that vote had cost. Athens had 30 days of democracy left before the Spartans installed what history calls the 30 tyrants. At the time, they were not called tyrants. They were called a committee, 30 men appointed to reform Athenian law during the transition. Their leader, Critias, had once studied under Socrates. What he had become was something that combined ideological certainty with personal savagery in proportions that frightened his own allies. Within weeks of taking power, the killings began. Theramenes, who had negotiated the surrender, who had positioned himself as the reasonable man in every crisis for 2 decades, raised objections. He had helped install the 30. He had assumed they would govern with the restraint that a man of his sophistication could recognize as necessary. He was wrong. Critias had Theramenes arrested and condemned in a show trial that made the general's trial look carefully reasoned. Theramenes was executed. The boot that fits either foot had finally found a floor it could not stand on. In the single year of their rule, the 30 killed approximately 1,500 Athenian citizens. Many more fled into exile. It ended the way these things usually end. Democrats organized in exile, marched back, fought a guerrilla campaign, and restored the government within a year. Athens came back. That is worth saying clearly. The city did not die. By 403 BC, democracy was restored. The legal system was rebuilt with explicit protections against the mass vote that had condemned the generals. An amnesty was passed covering most crimes of the Civil War period, a piece of political statesmanship that allowed the city to function without consuming itself in recrimination. And in 399 BC, the restored Athenian democracy put Socrates on trial. The charges were impiety and corrupting the youth. The real charge was harder to name, something about the way he asked uncomfortable questions, made powerful men look foolish, refused to accept that authority and truth were the same thing. The assembly of 399 BC, reconstituted and democratic, voted to execute the man who had been the only person in that assembly in 406 BC to say no to the illegal vote. He was given hemlock. He drank it with composure. The pattern that began with the generals completed itself in the agora of a rebuilt city, in the cup of a philosopher, on a quiet afternoon. Athens had learned nothing. Or rather, Athens had learned the wrong lesson. It had codified the protections against mass votes. It had not codified any protection against the particular combination of fear and self-righteousness that could make a free people want to kill the man who told them the truth. Here is what the collapse of Athens actually produced. Sparta's supremacy lasted 30 years. 30. The power that had spent a generation dismantling Athenian empire had no idea how to replace it. Sparta had discipline and force and Lysander's cold intelligence, but it had no apparatus for governing subject peoples, no ideology that could generate loyalty, no model for empire beyond the application of military pressure. Force without legitimacy decays. In 371 BC, 33 years after Aegospotami, Sparta was broken at the Battle of Leuctra by the army of Thebes. A single engagement undid what 27 years of war had built. Athens rebuilt. It always did. A second naval confederation formed in 378 BC. New alliances, new ambitions, some shadow of the old maritime influence. But the city that rebuilt was different in one fundamental way from the city that had fought Persia at Marathon. That city had believed it was invincible. The rebuilt Athens knew in its bones that it was not. And that knowledge, the loss of that irrational, necessary belief in one's own indestructibility, is not a minor thing. It is the thing that makes great powers reach when it matters, instead of calculating. When Philip of Macedon looked south in the 350s BC, he didn't find the Greeks who had humiliated Persia. He found the exhausted, fractious heirs of a civilization that had spent itself fighting itself. He found city-states that had been demographically, economically, and psychologically ground down by 30 years of internecine war. He found Athens arguing with Thebes, arguing with Corinth, while a new kind of army moved methodically through the north. By 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, it was over. Greece, as an independent collection of competing city-states, effectively ended. Not because Philip was invincible, because Greece was no longer capable of the unity it had found against Persia. The Peloponnesian War did not cause all of that alone, but it set the conditions. It shortened the moral horizon of every city it touched. It replaced the statesmen of Pericles' generation with the operators of Cleophon's. It made the habit of factionalism, the deep suspicion between classes and factions that sees every negotiation as a potential betrayal, the default mode of Greek civic life. And all of it traces back, in some way, to an assembly that voted to execute its own generals. Here is the question that Thucydides spent his life trying to answer. Was what happened to Athens an accident, or was it built into the system? His answer, buried in the architecture of his history, is closer to the second. Thucydides watched Athens make brilliant decisions and catastrophically stupid ones, often within the same decade, often about the same question. His explanation wasn't that democracy was wrong. It was more precise and more uncomfortable than that. Democracy under prolonged stress tends to reward the man who tells people what they want to hear and punish the man who tells them what they need to hear. Not always, not inevitably, but consistently enough that the pattern is structural, not accidental. The man who channels grief into fury will always have a larger audience than the man who counsels patience. The demagogue's advantage over the honest counselor is not intelligence or even charisma. It is that grief wants direction, not analysis. And a system built on popular votes gives structural power to whoever can direct the grief most effectively. The trial of the generals was not a bolt from nowhere. Athens had nearly voted to kill the entire population of Mytilene in 427 BC, reversed the decision by a narrow margin the next day, saving 10,000 people by a thread of rationality that happened to hold. The Sicilian expedition was the same dynamic. Alcibiades told the assembly what it wanted to hear, and the assembly voted for it, and 40,000 men died. Every time Athens faced a crisis that required thinking clearly rather than feeling powerfully, the outcome was uncertain. The system gave citizens equal voice. It did not give them equal wisdom. And when the crowd was frightened enough, and the demagogue skilled enough, the voice of wisdom, even the voice of Socrates, even at the moment when he was literally the only person in the room fulfilling the legal requirements of his office, was simply drowned out. What the war had done, across 25 years, was shorten the distance between fear and fury in the Athenian political psyche. It had killed the statesmen of Pericles' caliber and replaced them with operators. It had made the population simultaneously more desperate and more volatile, the precise combination that makes institutional safeguards feel like obstacles rather than protections. The law that said you could not try 6 men as one was not bureaucratic formality. It was an encoded recognition that crowds are capable of injustice and that the individual requires protection from collective anger. When the crowd shouted that protection down, it was not simply being cruel, it was being human in the worst sense of that word. It did what humans under sufficient pressure have always done: looked for someone to blame and removed every obstacle between itself and the blaming. A democracy that cannot protect its institutions from its own worst impulses in moments of maximum stress is a democracy that carries the mechanism of its own destruction inside it. Athens built the mechanism. The war provided the stress, the demagogues provided the match. Socrates was the only person in that assembly who did the right thing. One man, one committee. One afternoon in 406 BC, facing thousands of angry citizens who wanted blood, he said no. He was overruled. And history, to the extent it is honest about such things, has remembered him for it while forgetting the names of almost every man who shouted him down. That doesn't redeem the story, but it means something. It means that even at the worst moment of an institution's failure, there is almost always someone who sees clearly and acts accordingly, even without effect. The question every democracy has to answer, the question Athens failed to answer in 406 BC, is whether it builds systems capable of amplifying that voice when it matters most, or systems that drown it in the noise of the crowd. Athens built the Parthenon. It built the law courts. It built the assembly and the practice of public debate and the radical idea that ordinary people should have a hand in their own governance. These were real achievements. They were genuinely extraordinary, and Athens built nothing strong enough to stand between those achievements and the moment when its citizens decided the protections were inconvenient. The 6 generals were executed on a vote that violated Athenian law. The peace was rejected by a demagogue who understood anger better than strategy. The fleet was lost in an afternoon on an open beach because the men who could have won were dead, and the men who replaced them were told to ignore the one person who knew what Lysander was waiting for. Each decision the consequence of the one before. Each consequence the cause of the one after. The chain is tight and logical and terrible. The walls came down to the sound of flutes, and the city that had voted its own generals to death, that had rejected the peace, that had sent its last fleet to an indefensible beach and watched it disappear in an afternoon. That city had no one to blame, but the institution it had believed in most. A democracy had voted to kill itself. And the worst part, the part that makes Thucydides worth reading 24 centuries later, is that every step of the way, it had done so freely.